I knew something was wrong the moment my prized tomato plants started wilting. It hadn't rained much, but my farm's irrigation system was supposed to take care of that. And yet, every morning, my crops looked thirstier than a camel lost in the desert. At first, I thought there was a leak. Maybe a busted pipe underground. But when I checked, everything was in perfect working order, except for one tiny detail. The water meter showed more usage than ever before. And I wasn't the one using it. Then, I noticed something even stranger. My land, dry and dusty from the lack of water, stretched out beside a perfectly green, luscious lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine cover. That lawn? It belonged to my neighbor Karen. The same Karen who never had a single friendly word to say to me. The same Karen who once called the county on me because she thought my rooster was too loud. The same Karen who, despite living next to a farm, acted like she was running a high-end country club. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe she had a secret underground well, or maybe she just spent a fortune on watering her lawn. But the more I watched, the more suspicious I became. My water levels kept dropping, and Karen's lawn kept looking healthier. It was like a twisted magic trick, water disappearing on my side and reappearing on hers. That's when I decided to investigate. Late one evening, after making sure Karen's lights were off, I took a flashlight and walked along the edge of my property. My irrigation system was connected to a well, and it had a valve near the fence line that controlled the flow. And wouldn't you know it, someone had attached a hose to it. A long, snaking hose that stretched right under the fence and into Karen's yard. My jaw nearly hit the ground. She was stealing my water. Not a little. Not once or twice. She had set up a full-on water theft operation right under my nose. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. Who in their right mind steals water from a farmer? This wasn't just some suburban prank. This was my livelihood. My crops depended on that water, and here was Karen, happily turning my hard work into her personal sprinkler system. I felt the kind of rage that could turn a peaceful man into a legend in farm-town revenge stories. I stormed over to her house the next morning, knocking so hard on the door that her little decorative wreath almost fell off. It took her a minute, but eventually she opened it, her usual smug expression in place. She had the nerve to greet me like we were old friends, like she hadn't just been caught red-handed. "Oh, good morning. What brings you over?" she asked, tilting her head with fake innocence. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm. "Karen, I think we need to have a talk about my water." Her eyes barely flickered. "Your water?" "Yes, my water. The water you've been siphoning from my irrigation system." For a split second I saw a flicker of something, panic maybe, but she recovered fast. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. Why would I do that?" She even had the audacity to laugh. I pulled out my phone and played the footage I had recorded. It was dark, but the flashlight's glare caught the unmistakable image of her dragging the hose over and connecting it to my valve. Her whole body stiffened as she watched, and when the video ended, she let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes like I was the problem here. "Okay, fine. I may have borrowed a little bit. But it's just water. You have so much of it, and I only needed a little to keep my lawn looking nice. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal." She said it like I was overreacting. Like she had borrowed a cup of sugar instead of draining my farm's irrigation system. I could barely believe the words coming out of her mouth. "You've been stealing from me, Karen. Stealing. And you didn't even ask." "Oh, come on. Don't be so dramatic. What's a little water between neighbors?" I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying something I'd regret. She wasn't going to apologize. She wasn't even going to pretend to feel bad about it. No, she was going to act like I was some unreasonable farmer who didn't want to share. I could have called the cops right then and there. I could have yanked that hose out and cut off her supply immediately. But something inside me stopped. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was more than willing to get my hands dirty too. I gave her one last look, then nodded. "All right, Karen. If that's how you feel about it. She narrowed her eyes. That's how I feel about it. I turned and walked away, already planning my next move. If Karen wanted my water so badly, I was going to let her have it. Just not in the way she expected. That night, under the cover of darkness, I carried out my plan. I disconnected the hose and swapped my irrigation line with something else, a special mix of organic liquid fertilizer. The kind that was great for crops but had a smell that could clear out a town fair. It was completely harmless but would make sure Karen's lawn became the stinkiest, most unbearable patch of grass in the entire neighborhood. I could hardly sleep, anticipation buzzing through me like a swarm of bees. By morning, I was up early, waiting to see the fruits of my labor. And oh, did I see them! As Karen happily turned on her sprinklers, a mist of fertilizer sprayed across her yard. At first, she didn't notice. Then she sniffed the air, her nose crinkling in confusion. A moment later, realization hit. She let out a screech so loud it startled the birds off my barn roof. She ran outside in her fluffy robe and slippers, waving her arms frantically, trying to stop the sprinkler system, but by then, the damage was done. The foul odor spread like wildfire, clinging to her pristine white fence, her decorative garden gnomes, even her fancy outdoor furniture. And the best part? She had a garden party scheduled for later that day. I watched from my porch, sipping my coffee, as Karen ran around like a headless chicken, desperately trying to fix the mess. Her guests started arriving, only to gag and cover their noses. Some of them didn't even make it to the front door before turning back to their cars. Karen's face turned redder than my tomatoes as she scrambled to explain, but there was no explaining that smell. As the last of her guests drove away, leaving her alone in her stink-filled paradise, she turned and locked eyes with me. Even from a distance, I could see the fury brewing inside her. She knew. She knew I had done this. I simply raised my coffee cup in a silent toast. She had stolen my water. I had simply returned the favor, with a little extra seasoning. And this was only the beginning. The morning after Karen's grand lawn disaster, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The smell of justice, or rather, the overwhelming stench of organic fertilizer, still lingered in the air, wafting over from her yard like a reminder of her poor life choices. I took my time sipping my coffee on the porch, enjoying the sight of her pacing back and forth in her bathrobe, her phone pressed to her ear as she frantically tried to figure out how to salvage her once pristine lawn. She was gesturing wildly at the sprinklers, probably yelling at some unlucky customer service representative, but there was no undoing what had already been done. That fertilizer had soaked deep into her grass, and it would take weeks for the smell to fade. And the best part? Her perfect lawn was already starting to show signs of distress. The excess nutrients weren't exactly lawn-friendly, and by the afternoon, the vibrant green she had stolen from me had started turning patchy and yellow. Karen didn't take the loss gracefully. By noon, she stormed across the property line, her face twisted in outrage, her designer sandals kicking up dust as she marched toward my porch like she was leading an army. The only thing missing was a battle flag and dramatic background music. "You think you're funny, don't you?" she snapped the moment she reached me. I set my coffee cup down, leaning back in my chair with the kind of relaxed confidence that made her eye twitch. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Karen." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me, shaking with barely contained rage. "Don't play dumb. My lawn. That disgusting smell. You did something to my water." I tilted my head, pretending to think. "Oh, you mean the water you stole from my farm?" Her mouth opened, then closed like a fish gasping for air. She knew she had no way to deny it, not after I had shown her the proof. But Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat, even when she was standing knee-deep in the consequences of her own actions. "This is harassment," she finally spat. "You can't just poison someone's lawn because you're bitter." I let out a slow, exaggerated sigh. "First of all, it's not poison. It's 100% organic fertilizer, Karen. Perfectly legal. Safe for the environment. Great for crops. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make her second-guess herself. Just not so great for stolen water systems. Her cheeks flushed deep red, either from embarrassment or barely contained rage, probably both. I should call the HOA, she threatened. Or the county. You farmers think you can do whatever you want, but this is sabotage. I raised an eyebrow. So let me get this straight. You stole water from my farm. You got caught. And now you want to report me because you don't like what came out of the pipe you illegally hooked up to. Karen hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. She knew she was walking a dangerous line. If she pushed too hard, she'd have to admit to her own wrongdoing, and she wasn't ready for that level of self-awareness. Instead, she let out an irritated huff, flipping her hair over her shoulder like she was dismissing me. Enjoy your little victory, she sneered. This isn't over. With that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her house, probably to come up with her next ridiculous plan. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured she'd spend a few days sulking, maybe trying to wash out the smell with store-bought chemicals, only to realize that nothing short of time and rain was going to fix her mess. But I had underestimated Karen's pettiness. She wasn't just angry, she was vengeful. A few nights later, I noticed something strange. The sound of movement near my well. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon snooping around, but when I grabbed my flashlight and headed over, I spotted something far more interesting. Karen had hired 2 guys, probably some local handymen, and they were digging near my water line. Not just poking around, either. They had actual tools, a plan, and from the looks of it, a straight-up illegal operation in progress. For a second, I just stood there, stunned by the sheer audacity. She wasn't even trying to be sneaky about it. She had gone from casual water theft to full-on construction in record time. I stepped closer, clearing my throat loud enough to make all 3 of them freeze in place. One of the guys turned toward me, his shovel still halfway in the dirt. "Evening, gentlemen," I said, keeping my tone light. "Digging for buried treasure, are we?" Karen, who had been standing off to the side supervising, let out a nervous laugh. "Oh, we were just, checking something, property lines and all that." I gave her a slow, unimpressed nod. "Right, property lines. And that explains why you're knee-deep in my water supply." The 2 workers exchanged looks, clearly realizing they'd been dragged into something shady. One of them muttered something about not getting paid enough for this, before tossing his shovel aside and walking off. The second guy wasn't far behind. Karen, left alone in the dirt, crossed her arms and tried to glare at me like I was the one being unreasonable. "You don't even use all this water," she argued. "You have so much of it. I just needed a little." I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Karen, stealing water isn't the same as borrowing sugar from a neighbor. This is illegal. And digging on my property? That's a whole new level of dumb." Her eyes darted around, probably realizing that without her hired help, she didn't have much of a defense left. "Fine," she huffed. "I'll stop. But you're being ridiculous." I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures of the half-dug trench. "You'll stop because I'm calling the sheriff." That got her attention. Her posture stiffened, her hands balling into fists. "You wouldn't." I held up my phone, showing her the call screen. "Try me." She hesitated for a moment longer, then let out a frustrated growl. Without another word, she stomped off toward her house, defeated but still too proud to admit it. I didn't actually call the sheriff, yet. But Karen didn't need to know that. Over the next few days, I made sure to keep an extra close eye on my property. If she tried anything else, I'd have the authorities involved in a heartbeat. But something told me Karen had learned her lesson. Her lawn was in ruins, her reputation in the neighborhood was on shaky ground, and after getting caught in the act twice, she wasn't exactly in a position to keep pushing her luck. Still, with Karen, I knew better than to let my guard down completely. Because if there was one thing I had learned from dealing with her, It was that she never knew when to quit. I thought after catching Karen red-handed trying to dig into my water supply, she would finally give up. I had warned her, given her a taste of her own medicine, and even made it clear that if she tried anything else, the sheriff would get involved. Any reasonable person would have taken the loss and moved on. But Karen was not a reasonable person. If anything, my attempts to stop her had only made her more determined. For the next few days things were quiet. Too quiet. I kept an eye on my property, half expecting her to sneak onto my land in the middle of the night, but nothing happened. Her ruined lawn remained a patchy, stinking disaster, and she didn't even try to fix it. That should have been my first clue that she was planning something bigger. The first sign of trouble came one evening when I noticed a strange truck parked near her house. It wasn't a typical contractor's truck, and it didn't belong to any of her usual maintenance people. Something about it made me uneasy, so I kept watching. A few minutes later, I saw exactly what I had been dreading. Karen, dressed far too nicely for manual labor, was standing with a group of workers, pointing toward my land. One of the men was holding a clipboard, nodding along as she spoke. Another was setting up equipment, some kind of digging machinery. My stomach sank as I realized what she was trying to do. She wasn't just stealing water anymore. She was going all in. I walked over, already feeling my blood pressure rising. The workers noticed me first, shifting uncomfortably when they saw the look on my face. Karen, on the other hand, pretended she didn't see me until I was practically standing next to her. "Evening, Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Mind telling me why you've got a crew out here on my property line?" She plastered on a sickly sweet smile, the kind that meant nothing good was about to come out of her mouth. "Oh, I was just doing some upgrades to my property. You know, making a few improvements." I glanced at the equipment. "Upgrades, huh? And those upgrades just happened to involve digging directly toward my well." Her smile faltered for a split second before she waved a hand dismissively. "Don't be so dramatic. It's just a minor project. Nothing that concerns you." One of the workers hesitated before speaking. Ma'am, you didn't mention anything about a well on the other side of the property line." Karen shot him a glare so sharp he immediately looked back down at his clipboard, pretending he hadn't said anything. But it was too late. Now I had proof that she had lied to them about what they were digging for. "You're trespassing," I said, folding my arms. "And you're trying to tap into my water supply illegally." Karen scoffed. "It's not illegal. You're being ridiculous. Water is a shared resource. If you weren't so greedy, you'd be willing to help out your neighbors." I let out a slow breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "I help my neighbors, Karen. You are not my neighbor. You're a thief." Her face turned red, but before she could argue, I pulled out my phone. "You've got two choices. You and your crew pack up and leave, or I call the sheriff and let him handle it." The workers immediately started backing away. They weren't about to get mixed up in legal trouble over Karen's nonsense. One by one, they abandoned their equipment, muttering excuses as they made their way back to the truck. Karen stood there, watching them leave, her expression shifting from anger to frustration. "This is harassment," she finally snapped. "You think you can just bully me off my own property?" I gestured toward the equipment that was very clearly positioned on my land. "This isn't your property, Karen." She opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing she had no real argument. Without another word, she spun around and stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. For the next few days, I kept an even closer watch on my land, expecting her to try something else. But surprisingly, she stayed quiet. No more digging crews. No more sneaky hoses. No more Karen. It was almost too good to be true. Then, about a week later, I saw the "for sale" sign in her yard. I almost couldn't believe it. After all the trouble she had caused, after all the fights and petty revenge schemes, she was just leaving. I didn't know if the smell of fertilizer had finally broken her spirit or if she had just run out of ways to get what she wanted, But either way, she was done. Part of me wanted to celebrate, but another part of me felt like I needed to make sure she really understood what happens when you mess with a farmer. So, before she left, I decided to give her a little farewell gift. Early one morning, before the moving trucks arrived, I left a small bag on her porch. Inside was a container of organic fertilizer, the same kind that had ruined her precious lawn. Attached to it was a note. For your next lawn. Hope it thrives. By the time I got back to my porch, I saw her open the door, glance down at the bag, and let out an angry shriek loud enough to scare off a flock of birds. I smiled, sipping my coffee as she yanked the sign out of her yard in frustration. A few weeks later, Karen was gone. The house sat empty for a while before a new family moved in, and let me tell you, they were a breath of fresh air compared to the nightmare that had lived there before. They were friendly, respectful, and, most importantly, they watered their lawn with their own water. As for me, life went back to normal. My farm thrived, my crops grew strong, and my water stayed exactly where it belonged. And every now and then, when I passed by that empty house, I couldn't help but chuckle, because Karen had thought she could steal from a farmer. But in the end, all she got was a lesson she'd never forget.